In charge, but without boots on the ground, as Venezuela's deposed president faced his first New York court date on drug trafficking charges. Back in Caracas, Nicolas Maduro's regime remains intact. We'll ask how a U.S. president who promised no more forever wars will deal with a Latin American nation where local militias have their fingers in drug trafficking, gold, and yes, oil. Donald Trump's talked up oil, while the word democracy has yet to pass his lips since Saturday's raid. Why sideline Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado and the civilian opposition whose election win from 2024 was stolen? Will Trump ultimately try to install a U.S.-style occupation authority or simply do business with those currently running Venezuela? A Venezuela that's, yes, broken after years of sanctions and mismanagement, but whose institution and cohesion differ vastly from Iraq, Afghanistan, and other failed U.S. regime change experiments. How will Washington's new age of imperialism mesh with a Venezuela that's also about to enter a whole new era? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking, what is Trump's plan for Venezuela? With us from Montreal, Venezuelan journalist Germania Rodriguez-Poleo. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
From Boston, Venezuelan-American Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez, managing partner of Aurora Macro Strategies, adjunct lecturer at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. Good to see you.
Pleasure to be here, Francois.
From Bayonne in the French Basque Country, he's Ecuador's former foreign minister, Guillaume Long, senior fellow at the Center for Economic Policy and Research. Welcome.
Thank you for having me on the show.
And welcome to historian Justin Vaïs, founder and director general of the Paris Peace Forum. How are you?
Bonsoir, François.
Make it your New Year's resolution to listen, like, and subscribe to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. Beige jacket, orange sneakers, handcuffs, Nicolas Maduro, shuttled by helicopter bright and early from his Brooklyn detention facility to court in Lower Manhattan, where he pleaded not guilty. Your reaction, Germania Rodriguez-Poleo, to the images and to just, how fast it's all unfolded in the last 72 hours.
My initial reaction, and that of millions of Venezuelans at seeing Nicolas Maduro and Cilia Flores in handcuffs, is hard to describe. It's seeing a glimpse of justice for the first time in 26 years. It's important, of course, to note that Venezuela is still not free, but this was a victory for those of us who have only seen losses, trauma, violence, just to see those images. It's indescribable, and but it's still tragic that Maduro will be better fed, better treated than the political prisoners in Venezuela today.
There were outside the courthouse, we had our correspondent Jessica Lemaizoyer, and there were Venezuelans who shared your beliefs 100%, and there were others who were totally of the opposite idea, that this was a kidnapping.
They're not Venezuelans. I am getting reports from the situation outside the courthouse. And right now there's brawls going on because what's happening here is that pro-Maduro protests have been staged around the world by people who have no idea what the situation is. And most importantly, there's not a single Venezuelan in those protests. So real Venezuelans have come out to give them a piece of their mind outside the courthouse in New York.
Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez, what's been the mood, what's the feeling, both among Venezuelans that you've spoken to in the U.S. and those that are back home?
So I think it's something that's changing. I would echo that for many Venezuelans, there was a sense of sort of relief or of justice at seeing Nicolas Maduro, under those conditions. We've grown used to seeing regular purges, regular seizures of opposition, mysterious deaths, even outside of Venezuela, of people who have, acted or worked against the regime. At the same time, I think there's a growing sense of, wait a minute, we just got bombed. by the United States. And I'm seeing it a lot more palpably today than I was seeing it even yesterday. I think that there's an element in which Venezuela, it's a very, it's a very damaged and it's a very hurt country in many ways, but it's a very proud country. It still identifies itself as the country of Simón Bolívar, the first country to declare its independence from Spain and liberate a bunch of the neighbors, and a country that, isn't used to sort of those conditions. And I think that it's going to be something very difficult for Delcy Rodriguez, being in charge of Venezuela, to mitigate sort of that growing sense of why are we sending these really nice messages from the cabinet to Donald Trump when we just got bombed, within the Chavista base, but also I think potentially among some segments of the opposition. This is a country that still hasn't forgotten, bits of, the country that went over to Guyana 200 years ago. And I think as they process, I suspect that that's going to be a bigger and a bigger issue.
Yeah, Guillaume Long, those restrained messages, we heard them as well from Venezuela's ambassador to the United Nations at a special session of the Security Council. Earlier, the Venezuelans going to pains to paint themselves as the moderates in this situation. How's it going to play across the Americas?
Well, I think the message of this gross violation of international law, the first attack on the South American landmass on behalf of the United States in over a century, is a very stark message for Latin Americans. It's a message of a renewed US dominance in the Western Hemisphere, which has been spelt out by Donald Trump's national security strategy of reinvigorating the Monroe Doctrine and a very sort of brute force imperialism, which I think is a terrible message in the 21st century. That plus the violation of international law, the very basic tenets of the UN Charter, including Article 2 and pretty much every single article of Chapter 7. Yeah, well, that's very bad news for the peoples of the world. I mean, I understand, obviously, there are political passions inside Venezuela, and I don't want to, talk as a Venezuelan because I'm not a Venezuelan. But, I face myself in Ecuador, a very authoritarian government. I have many friends and comrades in jail and people are persecuted. And I would never call for the invasion of my country from the United States. I regard this as very dangerous. The potential for my people to be killed in my country from a US invasion is something that I regard very seriously. And I think all of us should be very mindful that violations of international law create a world which is a terrible world order where might makes right and where war is the end game. So I'm very concerned, and I thought 3rd of January was a very sad day.
Yeah, unlike in Panama in 1989, the United States here refraining from wholesale regime change for now, as stated by the president on the flight back to the White House from Florida Sunday night.
Dealing with the people, we're dealing with the people that just got sworn in. And don't ask me who's in charge because I'll give you an answer and it'll be very we're in charge.
We're in charge. Justin Vaïs, your reaction to that?
Skeptic. And the reason is Trump said on Saturday that we will run Venezuela. And I don't know how you run a country without being present, without governing it. So the next day, that was yesterday, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, said, no, we're not running Venezuela. We are maintaining leverage over the people that control Venezuela. So that means we're not talking about regime change. We're talking about president change, but the regime stays in place. That's evident now that Delcy Rodriguez in particular and her brother, who, by the way, was at the Paris Peace Forum a couple of years ago to try and negotiate with the opposition. We organized that with President Macron 3 years ago at the Paris Peace Forum. But Delcy Rodriguez and her brother are running Venezuela now. And so it's very different from Iraq. So we're not talking about de-Baathification, that is when the Baath party was wiped out of Iraq and all the structures of governance were destroyed, which largely contributed to the civil war in Iraq. On the contrary, it looks like the regime is going to stay in place. And Donald Trump, either out of jealousy for Maria Corina Machado, who got the Nobel Prize and he didn't, or because he doesn't want to upset the governance structures in Venezuela, has not sort of reinstated either her or the candidate who won the election in 2024, the election that was stolen by Maduro. So in other words, there's both dissonance between Trump and Rubio, and there's also the suspicion that they will leave in place the regime, the current situation. They will just exert more pressure. I would go even a bit further. We don't know whether there's been very little resistance to the kidnapping of Maduro, and so one of the questions was whether there was either bribery involved, or some of the elements of the regime decided that it was better to do without Maduro and just continue. We don't know that. I don't want to go into conspiracy theories, but it looks like we are in a very different situation from what we saw from Iraq, for example, or Libya, or the Gulf War.
All right, let's unpack what you just said. First of all, and this is Venezuela's interim president, she stated on Instagram that she wants to discuss cooperation with Washington. Now, the Financial Times reporting that the former vice president had reached out to the U.S. This is the statement that she put out on Instagram. She reached out to the U.S., and this was a year ago. The paper describes her as a canny political operator. She was envisaged already as a head of a transitional government in secret talks that her brother Jorge, that you mentioned, the Speaker of the National Assembly, led with Washington about a post-Maduro future, said two people familiar with the discussions. At the time, the negotiations had involved Maduro going safely into exile. So it appears as though this is not a first attempt. Are you saying that?
Yep, I wasn't aware of that last development, but obviously, there have been lots of talks in the recent month with the regime and discussions that apparently Marco Rubio put an end to. There were discussions about more access to oil, etc., and it turned out it didn't work out. And so I think what we saw was at least probably partly an arrangement, an agreement with at least some of the elements of the regime. Once again, no conspiracy theory, but what is evident to everyone is that we're not in a regime change situation. This is not about restoring democracy or Maria Corina Machado to getting her to power or changing the governance structures of Venezuela. It's really about just snapping Maduro, assaulting America's power, and making sure that America can get access to oil and to and do away with the Chinese and the Iranians and the Russians in the region.
All right, Delcy Rodriguez, portrayed as the pragmatist in a regime with plenty of hardliners, like, for instance, the Interior Minister, Diosdado Cabello. We can show you images of him appealing to the population for calm on Saturday. He was seen with his, there he is, with his military helmet. And there's also, we should mention him, Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez.
The Bolivarian government will guarantee the governability of the country, and our institution will continue to use all its available capabilities for military defense, the maintenance of internal order, and the preservation of peace.
Germania Rodriguez-Paleo, what happens next? Is this a smooth transition? Is Delcy Rodriguez's seat safe? Will she do business with Donald Trump?
First of all, there has been no invasion of Venezuela. Venezuela remains invaded by Cuba. That's why 32 Cuban officers lost their lives during the U.S. operation. Now, I have, to speak about Delcy Rodriguez, I have been warning about this for weeks, and this was my concern. Delcy Rodriguez is even worse than Maduro. Yes, she is a good political operative, but I have noticed this campaign to depict Delcy Rodriguez as a moderate. She is anything but. Now, I understand the Trump administration has different objectives here. Trump cares about oil. Stephen Miller cares about deporting people. Marco Rubio does care about democracy in the region, in Cuba, in Venezuela. So what comes next? Trump claims that Delcy Rodriguez is going to do as he says. We Venezuelans who know the nature of this regime are seriously doubting that. The U.S. is not in charge of Venezuela today. So is Delcy Rodriguez going to free political prisoners? That would be a good sign that she's doing as the U.S. said. Until then, I remain very, very concerned that Donald Trump is going to claim victory while leaving us with the system that began with Hugo Chavez 26 years ago.
Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, what does your crystal ball tell you?
So I agree with a lot of what was just said. I think that Delcy Rodriguez, compared to say Diosdado Cabello, is relatively moderate. I think that you would be hard pressed to find someone who next to Diosdado Cabello would not be relatively moderate. But what I would say is that because of that moderation, she has been the diplomatic face of this regime now, really for the better part of a decade. And the types of conversations she has are conversations that often have indirect ties with Washington. She's the person you send to talk to Chevron. She's the person you send to talk to Indian oil companies, to China, to Brazil. And as a result, and because her brother Jorge is the head of the National Assembly, she's executive vice president, legally speaking, are in what passes for law, in a country with a semi-active constitution and a stolen election within the last year, she should be safe. The reason she's not safe is because a lot of what decides policy historically in Chavismo is the interests of various non-legalistic actors, many of which are armed groups, and that's where the Rodriguezes are quite weak. So that's, in as much as being able to implement policy, Delcy's in a very difficult place because she has to keep the Diodados and the Padrino Lopez's and the Freddy Bernals of this world relatively happy, well-fed, and feeling relatively safe. And that's going to be very difficult to do when you're working actively with a U.S. government that just released an indictment against Nicolas Maduro, where Diosdado Cabello is a co-defendant. So that is, I cannot, imagine this being a long-term tenable situation. Either you have to, make a move against some of the sort of more strong-arm bits of Chavismo, of armed Chavismo, or sooner or later you're going to get eaten alive. Because I think that this idea that Marco Rubio can somehow act as a parole officer that, checks in with Delcy every 2 weeks, says show up at a certain time, don't do this, don't do that, why don't you try this? Even if she had all the best intentions, and I'm not sure she does, I do not think that she would be able to operationally execute on that, which was a problem, I think, for Maduro as well. There was a lot that he promised to do that he didn't do that probably could have, allowed him to at least stay on longer, but he was operationally unable to do. I think Delcy's even weaker than Maduro is in that regard. She's weaker at the Supreme Court, as we just saw yesterday. She's weaker at a lot of levels.
And so just to be clear here, if I follow your logic, you say there are several spheres of power inside of Venezuela. We know when Hugo Chavez was alive, he was running Venezuela. Who was the man or the woman in charge in Venezuela up to now?
I would say that Venezuela has sort of become the 19th century version of itself, partially because of sanctions, partially because of just economic decline, mismanagement. You have Nicolas Maduro, who until recently was able to basically run Caracas, maybe, parts of Maracay, parts of Vargas, where the ports are, the other main port, Puerto Cabello, the Colombian border, couple of very, a couple of oil fields, maybe a couple of illicit mining structures down south. But everything else is essentially a feudal system. You have military governors who are no longer getting any money from Caracas, who have become entrepreneurial, and they're involved in drugs trafficking, arms trafficking, people trafficking. And Maduro, he can give them opportunity. authorities, or Delcy can, but you can't really say you do this, you do that. So you have a system that's essentially a failed state outside of the capital, and you have to try and bring that to order with scarce resources, and now with even more damaged legitimacy than the last guy had, and doing so at a point where a lot of the actors who make it possible to enforce commands in the interior are very worried that this is a bad situation for them. I think if Diosdado Cabello hasn't fled to Russia in the next 2 weeks, there's going to be some sort of internal move.
Guillaume Long, is that how you see it, Guillaume Long? What's that right now? We expect a lot of instability at the top inside of Venezuela if there is no U.S. intervention and no boots on the ground.
Well, firstly, I think it's important to reiterate that as has been said, regime change has not happened, right? So there's government continuity. We'll have to see to what extent the government wants to negotiate with the United States and changes some of its policies. That's quite possible. I don't know. I wouldn't want to speculate yet. But regime change has not happened. I think a lot of analysts were saying before this, when the military build-up was happening, that regime change along the lines of what the US wanted to do was going to be difficult. This was not Panama 1989, 1990. This is Panama back in 1989, 1990, which was the last large-scale military operation, if you like. There were some operations in Haiti in the 90s and early 2000s. The last large one is Panama 1990 with a US occupation. Was 2.5 million inhabitants. Venezuela's 28 to 30 million inhabitants. Even after 7-8 million people leaving the country, it's still a much larger country, which is actually larger than Iraq was in 2003. It has large cities, big jungles, and a very politicized population. Granted, it's very polarized between Chavistas and anti-Chavistas, but you still have a strong Chavista base, and you have a very strong Chavista security apparatus, which has been strengthened by 25 years of regime change attempts, particularly the regime change attempts of 2019, 2020, when the security apparatus got tighter and tighter. Obviously, if you have coups that are attempted every now and again, and they fail, the would-be coup organizers or traitors or whatever you want to call them are purged, and the security apparatus strengthened. So it was always going to be very difficult for the US to do this regime change operation. So what we've had instead is Trump looking for an off-ramp. Rubio pressuring, obviously, for regime change, because that's what he wants. That's his agenda in the Western Hemisphere. He also thinks the road to Havana leads via Caracas, so he sees both things as very related. And he's been pushing, along with other neocons inside the US administration, for regime change and even for boots on the ground. Trump, reading the political climate in the US polls, not being very favorable to that intervention in Venezuela, I think was looking for an off-ramp, and he got very lucky. His off-ramp was seizing the head of state. Does he have more appetite? I don't know. We'll see. He seems to enjoy using his military toys and flexing his military muscles, so maybe there is some appetite there. But ultimately, politically, I think he'll be reading the situation and seeing that he can't really do regime change in Venezuela. And so that, having the trophy of Maduro is enough, and he needs to strike a deal with the Chavista government that remains in place. Essentially, that's how I read the situation now. I can't speculate the extent to which the current authorities in Venezuela are going to compromise, obviously, possibly out of fear as well, which is justified. The United States has a lot of capacity to cause harm and damage. We saw it through the sanctions, and now we've seen it through its military attacks. So we'll have to see what happens there.
Justin Vaïs, I just want to pick up on something you said earlier. You talked about the Paris Peace Forum in 2022, sitting down with the brother of Jorge Rodriguez. Tell us more about this image that they're the pragmatists. How did he seem to you in those discussions?
Well, that was part of a round of negotiation, and I should add that there have been several of them conducted by different actors, by Mexico, in particular by the Norwegians as well. And so what we offered at the forum in 2022 was, at the request of President Macron, we used the forum to host him and Gerardo Blyde from the opposition, the United Opposition, to try and see if some agreement was possible in view of the coming elections of 2024, alongside with the Argentinian president and the Colombian president, who were also present around the table. unfortunately, that didn't lead to any breakthrough, and we know how the elections of 2024 were stolen by Maduro, and so. But
did you have a sense he was buying for time?
I had the sense he didn't engage in a very truthful discussion, and this was very formal. I've not attended many negotiations, but these ones really seemed very formal with talking points and not much by way of compromising.
The man who, by all accounts, actually won the presidential election in 2024 in Venezuela has been communicating. Says it's not enough to have deposed Maduro, not without the release of political prisoners and recognition that it was Edmundo Gonzalez, pictured here, who won. But no such recognition is forthcoming from Washington, either for the former diplomat or for his backer. Maria Corina Machado has just won the Nobel Peace Prize. The Washington Post, citing two people close to the White House, reports that Machado's efforts to praise Trump after winning the Nobel last year, prize, as we know, long coveted by the president, failed to undo what one source described as, quote, the ultimate sin. If she had turned it down and said, I can't accept it because it's Donald Trump's, she'd be president of Venezuela today, the source said. Germani Rodriguez-Pelayo, does that seem like a credible version of why he's effectively thrown Maria Corina Machado under the bus?
I do not believe that that was the reason why. I did see that report. However, we have many other reports of what actually has gone down in these negotiations over the last months. Unfortunately, it's completely unrealistic to put Maria Corina Machado or Edmundo Gonzalez in power in Venezuela right now. Not because the population is divided, as one of your guests said. The electoral results from the last year tell us that at least 70% of Venezuelans want Chavismo out of the country. However, this is not just a bad government. This is a brutal dictatorship that has cemented itself for 26 years. The institutions are completely overtaken by them. The military is completely overtaken by them. As my fellow Venezuelan said, Diosdado Cabello remains in power of the armed forces there. Until Diosdado Cabello, Vladimir Padrino are out of the picture, it is completely unrealistic for the opposition to lead a transition. Other reports have told us that the White House asked Maria Corina Machado's team what their plans would be for a transition. Give us names, give us people in the military who would switch to be on your side. And they were not satisfied with those responses. And that's when Marco Rubio and Donald Trump see that that's not a real possibility. That's not to say that Donald Trump was not hurt by him not getting the Nobel Peace Prize. But all the information I have tells me that what I just explained is really what went down there.
Justin Vallis?
Let's look at the record of regime change by the US. I mean, the only successful operations were basically Japan and Germany after World War II, right? Because if we look at all of the other examples, vast majority of them are leading to civil wars or to disintegration, not to mention Iraq and Afghanistan more recently, but there are other examples. And so my point is, maybe not going there and doing what was called social engineering and thinking that the country would be fine if we just put a democratic leader at his helm, I think might actually be a prudent case, because civil war would be worse, and I speak under the control of the Venezuelans guests here, but a dissolution of power and a descent into anarchy and civil war caused by American intervention could lead to terrible situation.
Oh, see, so we get kind of to the heart of the matter here. Guillaume Long, if there are no boots on the ground from the United States, does the U.S. still own what's about to happen in Venezuela?
I'm not sure the verb owning is the right verb. They certainly have huge capacity to cause harm, right? They've caused harm since 2017 with sanctions and since 2019 with oil sanctions, which meant the decline of oil exports from 1.8 million barrels a day to 300,000-400,000 barrels a day. Yes, you could argue that oil decline is a longer ongoing process that has been going on since the early 2000s as a more structural systemic phenomenon. But as a product of sanctions, it was a dramatic drop, which was in part, and one I would argue, one of the main
Right, but excuse me, but after removing Nicolas Maduro, will the United States own the mess no matter what?
Well, I don't think they will. I think they will. What do you mean by owning the mess? Are they going to resolve the problem? No.
No, or is it going to be their responsibility?
Sorry?
Is Venezuela going to be Washington's responsibility?
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think the United States want quick political wins and have not much, don't really care very much what happens to the Venezuelan, particularly to the Venezuelan population. We've seen it over the last few years. Their policies caused a massive wave of migration. 7 to 8 million people left Venezuela between 2017 and 2023. And if there is war, or if there's more intervention, what used to be called euphemistically a state building, a nation building, the Trump administration doesn't even bother with those terms anymore. He's actually quite honest about what he wants, which is control, oil, power, and so on and so forth. Then, you could have an even greater humanitarian situation where civil war, as one of your guests says, is one option, but just humanitarian crisis, which I think is also why a lot of Venezuela's neighbors, Latin American neighbors, is very concerned, because they've seen what happened in the last few years, and they don't want it to be an even worse situation going forward in the years to come.
All right, in the shadow of Donald Trump and Marco Rubio during that Saturday press conference at Mar-a-Lago in Florida, and is Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, whose wife has since tweeted about annexing Greenland. He's standing behind him. You could behind Rubio, so you can't really see him in those pictures. But it's Stephen Miller. There you see him a little bit on the other side of him there. Let me ask you, Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez. You heard earlier Germania saying, when it comes, you have a Secretary of State who's the son of Cuban immigrants, who definitely wants regime change when it comes to Cuba. What does Stephen Miller want, and who's running this show inside of the White House right now? Is it Rubio or is it Miller?
That's a fantastic question. Before I get to the answer, I want to push back quickly on something that I believe Justin said. This idea that, Venezuela is a, powder keg primed for civil war. It's really not. I mean, it's a very ethnically homogenous country. There's no warring tribes. Up until the late 1990s, people spoke of Venezuelan exceptionalism because of how strong it was institutionally, how coherent. I think that the Japan and the Germany analogy that he used is actually the exact reason why it wouldn't be that. Because you had institutions in our lifetime. You have people who know how to work within an institutional subset, to lawyers who know how not to be a broker and to actually try and apply the law. Those people are older. A lot of them have left, but they exist, exactly like you had with the Meijis in Japan or with Weimar in Germany. This was a country that basically decided to implode on itself legally. It's sort of a self-torpedoing Lusitania of a country, but it doesn't mean that it can't become seaworthy relatively quickly if some of the conditions change. So I just wanted to say that before I start criticizing the Trump administration, because you do have a certain incoherence in terms of, I would say, incentives. Marco Rubio, I do think, has a hemispheric vision for a Latin America that is joined, that is led by the United States as sort of a first among equal peer country, coalition of the willing type of sort of like-minded governments, that share certain characteristics, pro-democracy, pro-capitalism, broadly anti-left. But with Miller, I think that there's this idea that it's all about immigration with him, it's all about domestic politics, and that's not my interpretation. I think Miller is actually, if there's anybody playing 3D chess at the Trump administration, it's kind of him. I think that a lot of the actions that have been taken on, not just on Venezuelan foreign policy, but on foreign policy elsewhere in the region, throwing tariffs at the president of Brazil for a decision the Supreme Court made, for example, the Malay bailout, all of those, you've had Miller sort of cropping up in the background. And I think a lot of it actually has to do with creating useful precedent. precedents, creating precedents that can be used now, that can then empower the Trump administration to do other things, or to be safer, say after losing a midterm in a few months. And I think that that's something that's really, really interesting and that not enough people are tracking.
So wait a minute, Daniel, just to be clear on that, just to be clear on that point, because it's an important one. You're stating that what it is a U.S. president who's pushing hard here with Venezuela to show how to flex the power of the executive branch of government?
In part. So, for example, with Nicolas Maduro, you have almost the perfect sandbox, because very few people are going to feel sorry for Nicolas Maduro personally, or think that Nicolas Maduro being in charge of Venezuela is a broadly good thing. This is a guy who brutalizes his people, has destroyed the economy of the country with the world's biggest oil reserves, has created a huge migration crisis that has destabilized the region. And on top of that, he's kind of a buffoon and he's hard to take seriously. That is the perfect foil. People will defend Maduro on sovereignty grounds. People will defend Maduro on international, but nobody's going to be, hey, why are you guys bullying Maduro? Why is this the only international strong man that you seem not to like? What's going on? That's actually something that's very useful. He's someone who's very difficult to humanize, really. And as a result of that, if you're going to start sinking small boats, it kind of makes sense to start at Venezuela before you branch out into the Pacific, before you branch out into other regions. So I think that there is sort of a chipping away at what we would consider sort of institutional constraints. See what can you do that will that Congress won't push back on. What will you do that the courts won't push back on, that the Pentagon won't push back on? And I think that there is sort of a bit of a slippery slope crawl going on there. The ultimate effects of which we probably won't see until after the midterms. If they had wanted to do this, if they had wanted to do regime change really, the solution would have been to wait 7 months. Petro's probably going to lose. De la Espriella would love to send troops into Venezuela. And that way you don't have to mobilize American forces. You don't have to get compared to George W. Bush and to Iraq or to Afghanistan. You could have had a partner there if you'd waited it out. The reason you couldn't wait it out is because that person wouldn't be in power realistically until right before the midterms, and that becomes too risky politically. So you act now when you can, and that gives you a very useful precedent, because if the United States can get away with doing this, then you have to start narrowing the conditions as to, what was it about this situation that made it so special? At least with George W. Bush, you had this argument of the weapons of mass destruction, but nobody really thinks that Maduro was, a few weeks away from an atom bomb. He was a huge problem, but he was the same problem he'd been a month ago or 6 months ago and was likely to be 6 months in the future. It wasn't a problem that was getting that much worse. So I think that that's something that, sooner or later the Trump administration, needs to answer, sort of the why now question. Because if not, claims being made in the New York Times that it was because he didn't like Maduro dancing, which I don't think are true, but in the absence of other information, I think that adds a layer of complexity.
At the end of the day, what is it all about? Guillaume Long.
Oh, I think it's about the reassertion of US military power in the Western Hemisphere. It's about spheres of influence. The United States has lost a lot of its economic might in the world, but in the Western Hemisphere, it's a relative loss, not an absolute. I mean, in absolute terms, the United States still plays an important role in Latin America. But, a lot of Latin American countries, particularly South American countries, now have closer trade relations with China. The United States, in this redrawing of this bipolar or even multipolar world, is thinking, hey, we need to hold on to our backyard. And that's what's going on. And Venezuela is the one, and we're going to throw in some crazy, bogus narco-trafficking narrative that not really most experts really believe in. There are, the same months that we free one of the biggest narco-traffickers, Juan Orlando Hernandez, former president of Honduras, sentenced for having trafficked more than 400 tons of cocaine. You go after Maduro on narco-trafficking charges, not so believable. So and very contradictory reasons given by the Trump administration, and a lot of them having to do, we're used to hearing democratization as a reason. Actually, a lot of them being honestly, exposed by the Trump administration. It's about power. It's about controlling the neighborhood, and oil is probably not the main reason, but it's a sprinkle on the top, which I think plays a role. And now, of course, we're seeing the Trump administration threatened other neighboring countries, most of them run by the left, which, of course, the Trump administration and Marco Rubio in particular hates. We've already covered this here on this show. So I think that's what it's about. It's about U.S. control in what it sees as its backyard. And it's about a pretty crude version of a return to gunboat diplomacy and a kind of imperialism that we were used to in the early part of the 20th century, but not so much, not in as crude a fashion in the last few decades.
All right, we're almost out of time. Germania Rodriguez-Pelayo, in your view, how much of this is about a world policy and a regional policy, and how much of it is, as you heard earlier from Daniel, domestic politics with Donald Trump flexing his muscle, particularly with, for instance, not briefing Congress before Saturday's operation?
First, I'm sorry, I have to correct something that's been said several times here and is a big piece of misinformation around the world. U.S. sanctions on the Venezuelan oil industry happened after Chavismo created the largest refugee crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere, 8 million people. Now, what's at play here? Like I said, every official has a different objective in the region. I do think overall the umbrella and what Trump wants is to return to have a presence in the Western Hemisphere, because right now China has a bigger presence around the oceans in Latin America. Cuba is still inside Venezuela. So yes, George Bush had the fear of nuclear weapons with the war in the Middle East, but in Venezuela, there are other concerns, and it's a shame that the Trump administration has not been able to explain them. The largest refugee crisis has destabilized the region. That should matter to Americans. It should matter to Americans that Venezuela is a base to Iran, Russia, and China. We have evidence of that. The Iranian regime plotted to kidnap an Iranian dissident in Brooklyn and take it on a boat to Venezuela. That's just facts. The Venezuelan regime is using illegal mining to finance their terrorism. There are all sorts of reasons why Venezuela is a threat to the Western Hemisphere. If you don't believe me, look at what doing nothing about Cuba has done, because Cuba has now gone to 2 other countries. That's the imperialism that's been going on in the Western Hemisphere. And I hope that the Trump administration is now going to say no more of that imperialism in our backyard.
Justin Vaïs, a final word on this?
No, just to agree with Guillaume. That is, I think with Trump, we're back to America first, to tariffs. We're back to the 1930s. And in the 1930s, Roosevelt is supposed to have said about Somoza that he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And so that's to link to the question of regime change. That is to say he didn't kidnap Maduro to install democracy, but to get, and I fully agree with what was just said, to get the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians out of the region, and to get more favorable deals, whether for oil or for other resources. And so I think we're just fully back about 80 to 90 years from where we are now.
And how Europe plays that is something we'll be discussing in Tuesday's show. I want to thank you, Justin Vaïs, for being with us. I want to thank as well Germania Rodriguez-Pelayo in Montreal, Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez in Boston, and Guillaume Long for being with us from Bayonne in southwestern France. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you.